In the midst of a brutal winter, when every other farm in Lancaster was running low on food, and the frost threatened to ruin what little remained, Eli Bender's root cellar stood as a quiet testament to careful preparation. While the world around him withered under the weight of the cold, Eli's faith in simplicity and hard work kept his family nourished through the hardest months they had ever known. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of faith, craftsmanship, and the simple strength of Amish living resonate with you, join us for tomorrow's tale. The snow fell thick and silent, blanketing the world in a sheet of white that seemed to swallow the sound of the outside world. Inside the Bender farmhouse, Eli Bender knelt beside his root cellar, the cold air creeping through the cracks of the wooden door. He wiped the sweat from his brow as he laid another crate of carrots beside the growing pile of stored vegetables. Despite the bitterness of winter clawing at the window panes, the cellar remained a sanctuary of warmth, preserved by the earth itself. Eli's mind wandered back to earlier that fall when he had spent long hours digging the cellar deep into the earth, far beyond what most farmers considered necessary. His neighbors had watched with raised eyebrows as Eli worked slowly, carefully, creating a space for his crops that others would have seen as excessive. Why dig so deep? Why store more food than anyone could possibly eat? The answer lay in the trust Eli had in God's plan, in the quiet faith that there would always be lean times ahead. He had learned this from his father, who had once told him, "In the harvest there's no glory in haste, son. The real reward comes in the winter when you've made provisions for when the days grow cold." His hands worked automatically now, placing potatoes in baskets, moving them further back into the cool, dark spaces of the cellar. The scent of the earthy vegetables filled the air, mixing with the faint odor of cedar wood that lined the walls. It was a humble task, this storage of life's simple necessities, but to Eli it was a sacred one. Each vegetable had been sown with care, tended with patience, and now they would keep his family alive through the harsh months ahead. He paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the season pressing down on him. The first snow had come early this year, and the frost had taken more of the crops than usual, but the root cellar, dug deep beneath the frost line, would keep their harvest safe. A sense of gratitude washed over him, and he silently thanked God for the wisdom of his father, for teaching him that survival wasn't about shortcuts or quick fixes. It was about steady preparation, faith in the seasons, and knowing when to rest and when to work. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cellar there was only quiet. Eli closed the heavy wooden door with a soft thud, securing it for the season. He turned back to the warmth of the farmhouse, where his wife Anna was waiting by the stove, the aroma of freshly baked bread filling the air. There was peace in the simplicity of this life, a peace that many of his neighbors had forgotten. The days grew shorter, and the snow piled higher. Eli had finished preparing the cellar for winter, but there was still work to be done. The firewood needed to be cut and stacked, the barn made ready for the cold. His wife Anna was busy in the kitchen, preserving the last of the summer's fruit and vegetables. It was a quiet, humble life, but there was a rhythm to it, a rhythm that kept the family in step with the land. The first true test of winter came early this year, when a fierce blizzard swept through Lancaster in early December. The wind howled through the trees, and the snow drifted in massive waves, burying the road to town and leaving the Bender farm isolated. It was in these moments that the true value of Eli's preparation became clear. While many of his neighbors relied on quick fixes and short-term solutions, Eli had dug deep into the earth and into his faith, preparing not just for what was easy, but for what was uncertain. The fire crackled in the hearth as Anna moved about the kitchen, her hands skillful and steady as she kneaded bread dough. Eli sat at the table, his hands folded in prayer, reflecting on the decision to build a root cellar so deep, so secluded, that even the harshest winters couldn't penetrate it. He had heard the whispers of his neighbors, the ones who thought he had gone overboard, that he had wasted his time and effort. But now, As the storm raged outside, he felt the quiet strength of his decisions. Their provisions were secure. Their faith was unwavering. Anna looked up from her work, sensing the weight of Eli's thoughts. She knew his heart, knew the quiet strength that sustained him, even in the face of the harshest challenges. "The children are warm, Eli," she said softly, breaking the silence. "We will make it through." Eli nodded, his eyes meeting hers. They did not need to speak of it often, but they both understood the deeper truth. It wasn't just the food in the cellar that would keep them alive. It was the faith in the provisions of the land, in God's care for them, and in the endurance of a simple, steady life. Outside, the storm howled through the night, but inside the farmhouse there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from the strength of the Bender family, bound together by quiet faith and the steadfast certainty that they had prepared well for the trials ahead. And in that quiet peace, Eli Bender knew he had built more than a root cellar. He had built a refuge for his family, not just for the winter, but for the long winters of life. The storm continued unabated, blanketing the land with its fierce embrace. For 3 days the wind roared through the valley, and snow piled high, covering the fields, the fences, and the barn. Inside the Bender home, there was a steady rhythm, a hum of activity that contrasted sharply with the chaos outside. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room, while Anna continued to bake bread and preserve jars of fruits and vegetables. Eli worked silently, sharpening his tools, his thoughts distant, yet focused on the work at hand. The root cellar had been a godsend. The temperature outside had plummeted to nearly 20 below, but the cellar remained at a steady, cool temperature. It was there that the true value of Eli's labor became evident. The carrots, potatoes, and turnips that had been harvested months before were still fresh and firm, their flavor rich and sweet. While the rest of the farm relied on what they could gather quickly from the field, Eli had prepared for these moments. He knew that when winter came, it came with a vengeance, and the land would sleep until the thaw of spring. Each day Eli ventured out to check on the barn and the animals. His breath turned to mist in the frigid air, and the crunch of snow beneath his boots was the only sound as he moved across the yard. The barn stood strong against the storm, the roof piled with snow, but the walls solid and secure. Eli had always been a man of caution, not because he feared the cold, but because he knew how easily the elements could turn against a person. He paused by the barn door, checking the hay stored for the cattle. The snow had piled up to the doorframe, but inside, the animals were warm and sheltered thanks to his careful preparations. Eli had made sure the barn was sealed tight against the cold, with thick insulation and plenty of firewood to keep the animals warm during the worst of the winter. When he returned to the house, Anna looked up from her task. Her eyes, though tired, shone with the quiet confidence that came from living a life rooted in faith. She knew that their work wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about living through it with grace, knowing that in every moment of hardship, God's provision was there. "The children are asleep," Anna said softly, her voice carrying the calm that Eli had come to rely on. "How's the barn?" "Secure," Eli replied. "The animals are safe. We have enough firewood for a few weeks, and the cellar will hold us through the rest of the winter." Anna nodded, satisfied with his answer. There was nothing else to say. In their world, there was no need for grand speeches or dramatic gestures. Survival was in the details, the daily tasks, the careful planning, and the quiet trust in God's timing. They were simply living out their faith, step by step. As the days passed, the storm raged on, but the Bender household remained untouched by the worst of it. While other families in Lancaster struggled to keep their homes warm and their food supplies from spoiling, Eli and Anna found peace in the rhythm of their work. The storms would eventually end, the snow would melt, and the sun would return. But until then, the Benders would survive, not by brute force or frantic effort, but through the steady, quiet endurance that faith demanded. By the end of January, the worst of the winter had passed. The blizzard that had come early in December had stayed for weeks, but now the snow began to melt, slowly giving way to the signs of spring. Eli Bender stood at the edge of the property, watching the thaw as it began to break through the thick layer of ice and snow. The wind had lost its bite, and the earth beneath his boots no longer crunched with frost. The land, though still barren, was beginning to wake. Eli had lived through many winters, but this one felt different. There was a certain peace in the silence of the fields, a stillness that came from the knowledge that, despite the storm's fury, they had made it through. The root cellar, with its carefully preserved crops, had given them more than just food. It had given them hope. The effort and patience it took to build it, to stock it, and to maintain it through the harsh winter had proved to be a lesson in humility and faith. The melting snow revealed the first hints of green in the fields, the tips of early spring grass pushing through the earth, brave and bright against the still cold soil. Eli knelt down, brushing his gloved hand over the fresh shoots. In the quiet of the moment, he allowed himself a moment of gratitude. This land, this simple life, had provided everything they needed, even when others had doubted their way of life. Anna had been busy inside, preparing their home for the change of seasons. The pantry was stocked with jars of canned goods, beans, peaches, tomatoes, and beans, while the shelves in the root cellar held the last of the winter's harvest. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving in a world that demanded both patience and perseverance. Eli knew this well. Over the past few weeks, the farm had become a place of renewal. Their neighbors had struggled to keep their homes stocked during the long winter, and while they had not starved, they too were now beginning to understand the deeper meaning behind Eli's careful preparations. Whispers spread through Lancaster, whispers of a man who had prepared for the worst and had, in turn, seen his faith rewarded. Many had taken note, and some had even begun to build their own root cellars, hoping to provide their families with the same security that Eli's work had given him. That spring morning, Eli felt a shift in the air, a promise of warmth, of new beginnings. The farm was alive once again, and with it, Eli's faith in the way he had chosen to live. His hands, rough and calloused from months of labor, touched the first of the new vegetables beginning to sprout in the earth. The cycle of life had returned, and with it came the reminder that the most profound lessons came not in times of abundance, but in times of struggle and preparation. As he turned to head back to the house, Eli paused to look back at the fields, the barn, and the root cellar that had sustained them. He wasn't sure what the future would bring. There would be more winters, more hardships, and perhaps more storms. But one thing was certain: through patience, preparation, and unwavering faith, they would endure. The thaw of spring had come, and so had the quiet joy of knowing that they had made it through, not just by chance, but through the steadfast belief in the simple, enduring truth. When you prepare for the worst, you live for the best. As the first days of March arrived, the Bender farm began to stir with the promise of new life. The air was no longer as bitter as it had been in the deep of winter, and the sun, though still weak, hung higher in the sky each day. Eli stood by the fence, his gaze sweeping over the property. The field that had once been covered in a thick blanket of snow now showed patches of exposed earth, soft and brown, waiting for the seed of a new season. The root cellar had served its purpose, and now the land itself, rich with possibility, was ready to carry them through another year. Eli had spent the morning in the barn, inspecting the animals and making sure the feed was stocked. Anna had been in the garden, gathering the last of the winter greens before the new crops would begin to grow. Together, they worked quietly, as they always had. There was no fanfare in their movements, only the rhythm of everyday tasks that had sustained them through the cold, dark months. Later, Eli sat at the kitchen table watching Anna prepare supper. The room smelled of roasting potatoes and onions, the warmth of the stove filling the house with the comforting scent of home. It was during these quiet moments, sitting side by side with Anna, that Eli truly felt the fullness of what his hard work had yielded. It wasn't just the food in their pantry or the warmth in their home, it was the peace of knowing they had survived, not by mere luck, but by preparation, patience, and faith. "Will the ground be ready for planting soon?" Anna asked as she set the bread on the table, her eyes reflecting the calm that had anchored their lives. "Soon," Eli replied, his voice steady and sure. "We'll wait for the last frost. But the earth is stirring. It's a good sign." Anna nodded, and for a moment they both sat in silence, listening to the fire crackling in the hearth. Eli thought about the journey they had taken. From the first day he had dug the root cellar deep into the earth, to the quiet perseverance that had gotten them through the hard winter. Their survival had been no accident. It had been the result of their decisions, their careful preparation, and their faith in each other and in God's provision. The children came running in from the barn, their faces flushed with the joy of spring's arrival. Their laughter filled the room, and Eli couldn't help but smile. This was what it was all for, the simple joy of family, the quiet pride of knowing that they had done the work, that they had built something that could endure. Later that evening, as Eli knelt beside the bed to say his prayers, he thought about all that had come before. His father's lessons had not only taught him how to build a home, but how to build a life that could withstand the storms. He had learned the quiet power of humility and faith, the strength of preparation, and the quiet grace of living in harmony with the land. The lessons of the hard winter would stay with him, shaping the way he approached every season, every challenge. And with that quiet peace, Eli closed his eyes, knowing that the spring ahead held the same promise of endurance, of faith, and of the quiet power of preparation. As the spring days grew longer, Eli's thoughts turned to the future. The farm was thriving, the crops were planted, the animals healthy, and the family was surrounded by the quiet joy of a life well lived. Yet, in the stillness of the mornings, as the birds sang their praises outside the farmhouse windows, Eli couldn't help but think about what he would leave behind. It wasn't a question of wealth or material possessions. Those were things that would fade with time. What mattered, what he hoped would endure, was the wisdom he had learned from his father and passed on to his children. It was the lessons of faith, patience, and hard work that had carried them through the toughest winters, the darkest nights, and the longest droughts. One afternoon, as Eli worked the fields with his eldest son, Samuel, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the work his hands had done over the years. Samuel, now a young man, had taken on more responsibility around the farm, learning the lessons Eli had carefully taught him. The bond between father and son had grown over the years, rooted in shared labor and quiet moments of reflection. "You know, Samuel," Eli said, pausing for a moment to wipe the sweat from his brow, "there's more to life than what we can see right now, the work we do, planting, building, caring for the land. It's about more than just surviving. It's about living in a way that makes this world a little better, even after we're gone." Samuel, who had always been quiet and thoughtful, looked over at his father, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I understand, Father," he said after a pause. "It's not just about the harvest. It's about how we live with the land, how we prepare for the future, and how we pass on what we know." Eli smiled, his heart swelling with pride. Samuel had been listening, had been watching all these years. The lessons Eli had learned from his own father, and the lessons he had passed down to Samuel, were now taking root in the next generation. The land would be theirs to care for, just as it had been his father's before him and his children's after him. The farm wasn't just a place, it was a legacy, a testament to what could be achieved when a family worked together in faith. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the air grew cool, Eli stood at the edge of the field, looking out over the land that had sustained him and his family for so many years. The root cellar, still sturdy and strong, stood as a symbol of everything they had built together. It was a simple thing, a humble thing, but it was more than just a place to store vegetables. It was a place where survival had been secured, where faith had been tested, and where the quiet strength of preparation had carried them through the hardest times. Eli knew that one day Samuel would take over the farm, just as he had taken over from his own father. The legacy of the land, of faith, and of preparation would live on, passed down from generation to generation. And as Eli looked out at the field one last time, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had done the work he had prepared, and his children would carry on, just as he had, with the quiet strength of their faith and the steady rhythm of the seasons. By the time the summer days arrived, the Bender farm was alive with the hum of growth and change. The fields that had once been barren and buried under layers of snow were now vibrant with crops, corn swaying gently in the breeze, beans climbing high on their poles, and tomatoes ripening beneath the warm sun. The work of the past seasons, the long hours of preparation, and the steady faith in the land had paid off. Eli stood at the edge of the field, his hands resting on the worn handle of his hoe as he surveyed the land. The promise of the harvest seemed assured. The soil, once frozen and unyielding, now held the fruits of their labor, its rich dark color contrasting with the pale blue sky. It was a season of growth, and for Eli it was a time to reflect on the quiet, unwavering faith that had carried him this far. Behind him, Anna was in the garden, her hands steady as she worked with the children, teaching them the value of each plant and the importance of nurturing life. Eli smiled as he watched them, the way Anna had raised their children, not just with lessons of the hand, but with lessons of the heart. The farm, the root cellar, the careful work they had done were all a reflection of the values they had instilled in their family. It was a legacy that would continue through their children, just as it had for generations before them. As the days grew longer, the evenings grew quieter. The harvest season, though still some time away, loomed large in Eli's mind. He thought back to the years when things hadn't been so certain, the years when he had struggled to make ends meet and had wondered if the work would ever bear fruit. Those were the times when his faith had been tested most, when he had to choose between following the steady rhythm of patience or giving in to the easy way. But through it all, his father's lessons had echoed in his heart: build for the future, trust in the work, and know that God's provision will come. As he turned to head back to the farmhouse, Eli's thoughts were interrupted by Samuel's voice calling from across the field. "Father!" Samuel shouted, his face bright with excitement. Eli turned and saw his son running toward him, his hands outstretched as if carrying some important news. "What is it, Samuel?" Eli asked, wiping his brow and walking toward his son. "Come see," Samuel said breathlessly. "The harvest. We have the first tomatoes ready." Eli smiled, his heart swelling with pride. Samuel was growing into a young man, and it filled Eli with a quiet joy to see him embrace the work of the land with the same steadfastness Eli himself had known. Together, father and son walked to the garden, where the first ripe tomatoes glistened in the sun, their deep red color a stark contrast against the green vines. It was a simple sight, yet one that held so much meaning for Eli. It wasn't just the fruit of the earth, it was the fruit of patience, of hard work, and of trust. That evening, as the family gathered around the table, Anna set a plate of sliced tomatoes before Eli. The smell of fresh herbs and butter filled the air, and for a moment the world outside seemed to fade away. There was no noise but the soft hum of conversation, the clink of silverware, and the contented sighs of a family nourished, not just by food, but by love, faith, and the simple rhythm of life. The seasons had turned, and with each turn, Eli had been reminded that there is no shortcut to success, only the quiet, enduring work of preparation, patience, and faith. As the days of summer began to wane and the cooler winds of autumn began to stir, Eli stood on the porch of the farmhouse, gazing out over the land. The crops were nearly all in. The root cellar, once filled with nothing but promise, was now stocked with the fruits of his family's labor, canned fruits, vegetables, and meat that would sustain them through the coming winter. The work of the seasons was done, and now it was time to rest. Yet, as Eli stood there watching the sun sink behind the hills, there was no sense of finality. There was no grand moment to mark the end of the season, only the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. This, Eli realized, was the nature of true success, not the loud celebrations of achievement, but the small, steady victories that came with living in harmony with the seasons. Samuel came up beside him, standing quietly for a moment before speaking. "Father, the harvest. It's been good, hasn't it?" Eli nodded, his eyes still fixed on the distant fields. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet. "It's been a good harvest." "But it's more than just that, isn't it?" Samuel asked, a thoughtful look on his face. "It's the work, the patience, the faith that got us here. You've taught me that, Father. It's more than just the crops we pull from the ground." Eli smiled, his heart warm with pride. "It's about understanding the land, Samuel. It's about seeing the long road ahead, knowing that each season has its own purpose, its own time, and in the end, we trust that the land will provide what we need." The quiet truth of his words settled between them. Eli had learned this lesson early in his life, and now it was his son who was beginning to understand. It wasn't about being in control. It wasn't about forcing outcomes or rushing to the finish line. It was about the slow, deliberate pace of life, the patience to see things through, to trust in the work, and to have faith that in the end, the work would bear fruit. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Eli sat at the table with Anna. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft glow on their faces. The house was warm, the food plentiful, and the quiet of the evening wrapped around them like a blanket. "We've made it through another season," Anna said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years spent in quiet labor. Eli nodded, his eyes tired but content. "Yes, we have," he replied, his heart full of gratitude for the work, the faith, and the family that had carried them through. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for loud proclamations. The quiet triumph of the season, of the work done and the lessons learned, was all Eli needed to feel the fullness of what he had accomplished. As the fire burned low and the night deepened around them, Eli and Anna sat in peaceful silence, knowing that though the work of one season had ended, the work of the next would soon begin. And in that quiet understanding, Eli knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, with faith, patience, and the quiet strength of a life well lived. As the first frost of November settled over the farm, Eli and Anna stood together in the doorway of the farmhouse, gazing out at the land. The trees, once vibrant with autumn color, now stood bare against the gray sky, their limbs silhouetted in the cold. The world had entered its quiet rest, and for Eli, it was a time for reflection. The year had passed quickly, but not without its share of challenges. Yet, as he looked across the now harvested fields, Eli felt a quiet pride in the work they had done. The root cellar was full, the barn was sturdy, and the farm was prepared for the months ahead. There was nothing more to do for now, except wait for the coming of the next season. Eli turned to Anna, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's a good feeling, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft. She nodded, her hands clasped in front of her. "It is. We've worked hard. And now, we wait for the spring." Eli's thoughts drifted back to his father and the lessons he had learned from him. His father had always told him that the work was never finished, that there was always something to be done, but there was also time for stillness, for resting in the quiet moments between the seasons when the land was dormant and the world slowed down. "Do you think Samuel understands?" Anna asked, breaking into his thoughts. Eli looked out over the farm, his gaze distant. "I hope so. He's learning. Slowly, but he's learning. The work we do, the faith we carry, it isn't something that can be taught all at once, but he's got it in him." Anna smiled, her eyes filled with the quiet hope that had always been a part of their life. "He's got you in him, and that's enough." Eli's heart swelled with love for his family, for the life they had built together. He had passed on what he had learned, and in his children he saw echoes of the work and the faith that had shaped him. It wasn't about wealth or grand accomplishments. It was about the quiet strength of a life rooted in simplicity, in faith, and in the cycles of the land. As the cold deepened and the world outside seemed to grow quieter, Eli and Anna turned back into the warmth of the house. The seasons would come and go, but their legacy, the work of their hands and their hearts, would endure for generations to come. The winter months passed slowly, as they always did, with long nights and short days. The Bender household remained steady, the fire crackling in the hearth, and the scent of baking bread filling the air. Eli spent his days sharpening tools, reading the Bible, and keeping the farm in order. Anna continued to preserve what was left of the harvest, preparing for the time when the snow would melt, and the land would once again call for planting. One afternoon, as Eli sat in the quiet of the farmhouse, Samuel entered the room, his eyes bright with determination. He had been working alongside his father for years, learning the rhythm of the land and the wisdom that came with it. Now, as he stood before Eli, there was a new confidence in him, one that Eli had been waiting for. "Father," Samuel began, his voice steady, "I think I'm ready. I want to take on more of the work, to help more with the farm." Eli looked at his son, his heart filled with both pride and gratitude. "You've always been ready, Samuel," he said quietly. "The land has taught you what it can. Now it's time for you to take what you've learned and make it your own." Samuel nodded, his hand steady as he spoke. "I know I've learned much, but I feel like I'm just starting to understand the depth of it all. The land, the faith, the work. It's more than I ever realized." Eli smiled, his gaze warm. "It's a lifelong journey, son, and it's one you'll carry with you wherever you go." That evening, as they gathered around the table for supper, Eli couldn't help but feel a quiet peace in his heart. The promise of the future was not just in the crops that would grow the following spring, but in the strength of his children, in the way they had embraced the lessons of the land. The legacy of faith, patience, and hard work was being passed on, not just through words, but through actions. Samuel's readiness to step into the role of stewardship was a sign of the future Eli had worked toward, one where the lessons of the past would continue to shape the generations that followed. The work of the land, the quiet faith that had seen them through every season, was a promise to the future. And as Eli sat back, watching his family, he knew that it was a promise that would endure through every season, through every challenge, and through every quiet triumph.